Monday, everybody. How's it going?
It's going well. Happy Monday.
It is a happy Monday.
Good to have you here, Kevin.
Kevin's
Great
here.
to be here.
I just realized that if Kevin and I could basically swap pictures and it would be about the same thing. So,
Well, so Joe is a deep fake composite today of Kevin and I. Basically, we're just rendering Joe.
so that's hilarious. Yeah. Well, awesome. It's good to see you, Kevin.
Yeah, great to see you both.
Yeah. Last time we saw you was actually in Boston. We took a nice stroll around the city. You showed us around. It was great. So it's good to see you here again.
Yeah, great to have, you guys visit the city. We had a nice walk down Comm Ave and Newberry Street. And, thank you, Matt. I don't know if now's the right time, but you totally nerd sniped me with the Isaac Newton book.
Oh, awesome! I saw that on LinkedIn. I love that book, but I haven't read it for it's probably 10 years ago or something. So
It's, I thank you for, my team is sick of me talking about it. And, I've probably recommended it to enough people that, if Isaac Newton doesn't send me a little bit of a kickback, I'll feel like, what are you doing? But it's such an incredible book and related to data, I would argue.
What was this book?
so it's
It
called.
was.
Go ahead.
Go for
Yeah,
it.
I'll let you tell about it because you'll probably do better. I mean, you've read it more recently, right?
Oh, no, please jump in. It's so Isaac Newton, in the last 10 years of his life, he was not a physicist. He was actually master of the Royal Mint. So he was in charge of printing money for England. And it was important that you got someone like Isaac Newton at the time because, Britain was undergoing several monetary crises. One, they were fighting a war with France, as they tend to. So then they're spending a lot of money there. Two, the value of silver coins was actually greater if you melted it down and sold it in France or Belgium than keeping it as coins in Britain. So tons of coins were going out, and there were some master counterfeiters going around, creating their own copies of the coins of the time. And it was Isaac Newton's job to handle all of that.
Interesting.
And people would do things like they would basically load up a ship of silver coins, take them to another country, exchange them for gold at a different exchange rate. So basically arbitrage, and then take another ship back. This was totally illegal. Like if you got caught, you would be executed. And so that was kind of Isaac Newton's job to catch things like this using data, and to also catch people like shaving the edges off of coins to remove excess silver. They would do all kinds of tricks, basically. I mean, you can imagine the problems that arise from a physical monetary system, physical metal monetary system, how that would be a problem.
Interesting. Well, this is a good segue, I suppose. so counterfeiting, Isaac Newton,
Yeah.
and data observability. So,
Well, speaking of data observability, I think one of his first actions when he became master of the mint, which, by the way, he had an incentive because master of the mint, they got a cut of all the coins that they printed. So they're very wealthy individuals.
I'd forgotten that detail.
Yeah,
that's a pretty important detail.
Yeah.
And he was trying to get out of Cambridge and move to London at the time. But the first thing that he did was measured everything, right? Whether it was horses carting like raw silver out of delivery, to every part of the supply chain within the factory, to how quickly people were stamping the coins down. You'd have to have someone come in there, trigger it, stamp it, take out the coin. People obviously lost a lot of their fingers and limbs from doing that, but workers protection wasn't really a thing in the late 1600s.
Nope.
But he just came in and measured everything and probably got a 2 or 3x improvement with the same same ingredients.
Joe's a process guy. You should totally read this book.
Yeah, you should.
I'm going to write it down. Yeah, that
Yeah.
sounds fascinating.
Yeah.
So he's one of the first process improvement people then probably too.
Exactly. Yeah. The other thing that's really fascinating about this book is that the author argues that the physics revolution that happened in the late 17th century was really triggered by data collection, and data collection was triggered by cheap paper. Like basically once you had the printing press, that drove paper production, which drove cheap paper. Before that, you wouldn't take notes because paper was very expensive. So like taking notes was kind of a big deal. And after this, you could just take notes on anything. And so suddenly you had, Tycho Brahe and you had Kepler's laws as a consequence of all that data collection. And Newton basically just built on top of Kepler's laws.
Interesting. Huh. Yeah, learn something new every day. In fact, speaking of learning something new every day and kind of tying it back to data quality and observability, we're in typical nerd fashion. We were also talking about cuneiform before we started.
That's right.
So for the audience, you're prepared to be very enlightened during this chat. This is literally, it was kind of funny. As a side, like we were just literally walking around the square in Boston, and this Matt and Kevin are talking about Isaac Newton, and I'm just watching birds or something. But then about a few minutes ago before we started, Kevin brought up. Why don't you tell them about what you're talking about? One of the earliest issues of data quality.
Oh yeah, I mean, because it feels like everything that's old is new again. Like you're saying, the same problems that we face today of like organizational trust in data, getting people to use it properly. It's like 2022 now. Didn't we have these same problems in 2012? A different set of tools, and also in 2002. And you could say, okay, this actually goes back quite a bit, even back to like Edgar Codd, where some of his main motivations in his original, relational algebra papers was to fix data quality and get people to use it in an organization. But some of the earliest pieces of writing that we have as a civilization are like ancient cuneiform, but etched onto tablets. This iconography, and the earliest piece that we have is actually a transaction. I believe it's like a barley transaction, saying that I delivered X number of bushels or whatever unit of barley to you. So it was data collection, right? It was accounting, and I believe this piece, or one of the earliest pieces, had a data quality issue. They had a typo, right? Like mixed in like the wrong symbol somewhere. So in some ways, data quality has plagued us from the dawn of civilization.
It's possible that could have been fraud too.
Totally, exactly.
So if Isaac Newton was back then, he would have.
He would have snuffed them out.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Well, cool. Yeah, I mean, walk us through this. I mean, that's an interesting story, and we were kind of talking before. What's old is new again. What got you into the data observability space? I mean, so I'm very curious about your path.
To found one of 30 data observability tools. Yeah, well, kind of how I got into data was originally through studying physics as an undergrad, where I noticed that we had an experimental lab course. Everyone had to take this course called JLab, and it was notorious for being kind of a killer course. Spend 30, 40 hours a week replicating a Nobel Prize winning experiment every 2 weeks.
Yikes.
And it was tough, but I noticed one of the best parts of undergrad for me was being able to learn alongside really amazing students, some like physics Olympiad gold medalists who live on another dimension. They and they would struggle with this course too. And I realized that they amazing physicists, some of them are professors today, but the hardest part for them wasn't to collect the data, it was actually analyzing it and presenting the results. In other words, taking the spreadsheet and analyzing it in MATLAB. Like the people who had the hardest time in the course, were those who weren't very comfortable programming. So I kind of took that, and my sister at the time she is a biologist. She had 5 years of data on collecting, the behavior of cichlids, types of tilapia. And at the 6th year of her PhD, she's like, Kevin, can you help me analyze this data set? And I was like, how absurd is it that some of the brightest minds in the world are just bottlenecked, not because they don't have the data or the scientific background, they just don't know how to pass it into your machine into a way that makes sense. So that's how I got into the data world, probably like 8 or 9 years ago, and spent the next 6 years doing machine learning and data visualization research, trying to make that easier.
That's interesting. That's quite the path. So
Yeah, I mean, I guess we've all ended up here by various circuitous paths that were unexpected. So
yeah. Matt, you also did your PhD, right, Matt? So
my PhD was in representation theory at the University of Utah. So it's funny. I mean, more broadly, I think a lot of pure mathematicians and theoretical physicists kind of struggle working with data because it's very it's kind of a very blue collar job in some sense, but it's a really critical job to actually get insights into how the universe works or how biological systems work. Yeah.
That's interesting.
It's funny too, because I would say there's almost like a social capital problem in academia around using modern data tools. I don't see too many people, for example, using data warehouses, which kind of made sense, 10 years ago when a data warehouse would require a $6 million contract. But these days, like there's so many of these data warehouse tools that you can just spend a few dollars on, and people are, I mean, not to trash talk Excel, but I'm going to a bit. I think you're a big fan of Excel, Joe, right? And it makes sense. It's useful for a lot of things, but once you get past a certain data scale, you kind of need a better set of tools, and it's amazing what you can do with a fairly simple data warehouse tool, or even something like Spark SQL, for example.
Interesting.
Yeah, Excel definitely gets a bad rep. It needs to be marketed better. The first fully reactive, no code programming interface.
Yeah, and I mean it's interesting because I looked at the stats. I mean, unofficially, I think there's over 750 million Excel users in the world.
Yeah.
So, as my friend Dave Langer says, I mean, he it's just the most widely used data and programming platform on the planet. And so he just teaches Excel, right? And I'm actually still decent at Excel. I still know a lot of the shortcuts and crazy whiz bang stuff, but it's like I kind of moved on from it just because I don't really have a need for it. Actually, George Furican has a question for you. Back to data observability. What's up, George? How's it going?
George.
Lights on data. He's an awesome guy. You need to get a hold of George sometime. He's really cool. You guys are on the same wavelength. But he asks, who in the organization would be responsible for data observability?
That's such a good question, and no surprise that it depends on the organization, right? Like one of the beauties, I think, as a tiny tangent of working in data is, data is relevant across verticals, right? Some of our customers are like e-commerce shops, other ones are fintech companies, B2B SaaS, B2C SaaS, and across sizes too. Whether it's like a 10,000 person behemoth or a 5-person team, where the person who's doing data, quote unquote, doesn't have data in their job title. They might not even know what data engineering is, but they do know what BigQuery is, and they know what a dashboard is. So, the fact that data observability, at the end of the day, it exists to solve problems, right? Like data observability is not a problem. Data quality is a problem. Spend management is a problem. And those are problems that affect not just the analytics team or the data team, but everyone else in the organization, people who are consuming data. So given the fact that data observability exists to solve problems for people everywhere else in the org, then the question is, who is responsible for solving those problems? And typically it is like the head of data or the head of data engineering, at least. Those are, our primary customers. But, that's the person who's responsible. The person who faces the pain is a whole nother question. And it's usually the person who's writing, a DBT model or who has the console open the most.
That's interesting. What is a head of data to you? I've asked this question, and it's not actually an obvious answer.
That is, like, what is their job title? Or
I mean, what do they do?
I think about some of the best heads of data that I've encountered in the past. And I think the one thing that they all have in common is hiring, for sure. Like actually growing out the data team, which is no small task. I think that's actually probably the biggest problem facing most data teams today. Nothing related to the technology that is coming out and be very exciting. It's actually, hiring data engineers that fit the profile.
That's interesting. Yeah, there is definitely a big hiring squeeze. We've done several episodes on this, and I think we could probably talk ad nauseum. Matt and I could just have probably an hourly show every day and talking about hiring and data, and we'd get lots of reception and probably find no shortage of things to talk about. It's just it's a huge supply problem right now. I mean, how much do you think that tooling can help augment, and I hate to use the word replace, but kind of maybe amplify a smaller team and help it punch above its weight class? without having to add to the team?
I think, yeah, so there's almost like two different models of how you want to run a data team, right? Do you want it to scale linearly with the size of the organization? So you have like almost like data slingers ready to go. Or do you want like a very high leverage data team, so to speak? So for example, Notion, I believe, has a relatively small data team. Of course, they're a relatively small company, but a lot of these new like startups are opting for smaller teams so that the ratio of like headcount to like tech spend is actually quite low.
Mhm.
Vendor is also a good example where the team there is relatively, lean, but they're doing a lot of damage with the right tools.
Mm. Like hopefully in a good way.
In a good way, yeah.
Okay.
Right, yeah. Having a lot of impact.
Okay. That's interesting. I mean, what are some of the trends that you're seeing in not just data observability? I know that's kind of the topic of this talk, data observability trends in 2022. But I guess kind of hitting on that, you also you touched on the big one, which is hiring. I mean, what are some of the other trends that you're seeing right now?
Just to hook onto the hiring one for a second, I think what I'm really excited for in 2022 is how organizations think about data differently internally.
Mm.
Of course, we've seen this shift away from being an IT cost center to being its own org often. But it's an open question about where does that org live, right? Is it under the finance team? Is it under the engineering team? And I have no super strong opinion either way. I just know that the companies in which data is under like engineering, they tend to have a lot of headcount, right? And a lot more resources put in their direction. So I'm just excited to see that become more a part of the dialogue today. And beyond data observability, I'm super excited about seeing data, like the data warehouse become a backend, so to speak, to more and more production systems. And of course, reverse ETL is one manifestation of this trend, where the best way for something to become a backend is not to have it connect to your warehouse, but just to ship it out, send these bits of information away from the warehouse towards your tool.
Do you do observability on the reverse ETL pipelines as well?
Not yet. I think the metadata and the API is not fully mature yet for some of these vendors, but we are talking with Census and High Touch.
Cool.
Trying to make that.
Yeah, because it's an interesting thing. Like I was talking to some friends of mine that are doing reverse ETL. I think they're probably one of the earliest people using these modern tools. But they brought up an interesting point where reverse ETL is it's a great idea and it's great in practice, but the feedback loop between that and the system you're sending data back to, you have to get that right now. Whereas in analytics, it's like, your report's wrong. Maybe I'll fix it, maybe not. But when I send it back to a source system, now you've just created a feedback loop. Say you send data to your CRM. Well, that data goes back into your data warehouse, which then gets say you're doing a scoring model, gets rescored and sent back to your and so forth, right? So now you have this kind of vicious cycle where if you get that thing wrong, or say there's a fault in your pipeline or something like that, then that starts having consequences. So
totally. I feel like there's an order of operations in which tools naturally get adopted, so that many prospects who come to Metaplane or any data observability tool, I think many of them have recently adopted reverse ETL and bumped into that problem that you faced, where a dashboard going down for an executive, it is a problem and it can be very painful. But depending on how you patch it up, it might not be the biggest problem. But like you're saying, the moment you complete this loop and you sent the wrong email to the wrong customer, time to get a pulse on it.
I mean, the classic example, one of the oldest examples of reverse ETL is just putting bids back into Google Ads, right? You pull the data out of the API, do some calculations. It might just be like linear regression or something, push it back. Yeah, if that goes wrong, then you can spend a ton of money very quickly. Things can break in all kinds of terrible and interesting ways.
And in other words, like the downside is just increased, right?
Yeah.
Previously the downside is like kind of capped if you have people responsible for every dashboard, but the downside can essentially become more limitless once you tie it back into these systems.
How do you respond to companies when they say, well, I know my data is wrong, but it's at least directionally correct? Like, so that the trends are somewhat there. We'll just go off that. I mean, do you ever find that?
We do find that. Yeah, I think in some ways I say like good luck, and that might be good enough, right? Because if that's the response, it kind of suggests that you might be using data for the organizational decision making, right? Not necessarily to feed into a model or like a recommender system or back into your go-to-market tools. And in some ways, data becomes one part of your decision-making ensemble, right next to going with the highest paid person in the room and going with your gut. I'm not trying to be facetious here, but if that's the stage of how data is being used, then there probably isn't a use for observability there.
Right. I could definitely see that. Interesting. What are some anti-patterns that you see with observability?
I would hesitate to call this an anti-pattern because it's actually like very good practice.
Mm-hmm.
But writing what are essentially unit tests on data, like I think it's very natural once shit hits the fan or crap hits the fan once to then start writing a SQL query that you start orchestrating on a regular basis, or use a library that asserts an expectation on data to get that in place and then kind of call it a day. And don't get me wrong, that is actually very important. I think almost every data team should do that. It just doesn't scale very well. So that one common cause of failure that I've seen in teams is this becomes the default way of testing your data and trusting your data. And there's two problems there. One is that it takes forever, right? It takes a very long time to check the data and post up a new PR just as it trended in one direction. Two is that it kind of gives a false sense of security in many ways, of like you write expectations to catch the error, like the known issues, right? But the unknown unknowns will always come out to bite you, and that's part of the exciting part, but also a challenge of working data observability, is that there are always unknown unknowns.
Yeah, one thing Joe and I talk about a lot is the fact that data has entropy, especially in software development. You have this notion of domain-driven development, right? And people have different control of their different parts. But with data, like the domains are so big and they're so far outside of your control, even something as simple as collecting data from your website. Well, you can get hit by bot traffic. You can see a sudden user spike in a country where you weren't expecting it. You can see all these very entropic processes. And I think simple logical expectations, which are very analogous to what we do in software engineering, just simple logical unit tests, aren't going to catch problems like that in general.
I love the way you phrase that, like the entropy, like both outside of the analytics team, right? I think Sarah Krasnick from Perpay, she talks about how like the data quality is very much it originates outside of the data team, and is faced by people also outside of the data team, right? As much as we talk about Snowflake being your single source of truth, it's the source of no truth in some way, is a source of no data, right? And yet it is very important infrastructurally. And same thing with the data team, like you're saying, right? Like at the end of the day, we don't know better than the domain experts who generated and used the data. And yet there's this subtle expectation that we should know better than them.
It's interesting insight.
Yeah,
Let me ask you this question. Go ahead.
Oh no, go for it. Go.
So we've talked a lot today about data warehousing, and on Tobias Macy's podcast you did as well. How did you decide to start with data warehousing rather than say data lakes when you were designing, when you came up with the idea for Metaplane?
Or I'll extend that source databases.
Yeah.
I listened to your last Monday morning data chat, which was awesome, with the Denver data dude. And the 3d.dev, we should get that domain. But the question is like, why are there 30 data observability tools? And of course, the number one reason is the US federal interest rate, 0.25%, which, leads to more money in LPs, more money in VCs, and more money in startups. Okay, but that issue aside is just to go on a little bit of a tangent, like,
oh, please do. This is Money Morning Data Chat.
Okay.
We always go on tangents. Yeah.
The place for tangents.
Okay, for this guy Richard Hamming, he a computer scientist, inventor of the Hamming distance. He also wrote a lot about how to do research, and he has this framework of, okay, you want to work on the most impactful problems, of course, but you also want to work on the problems that you have an attack on. So, like, what are the biggest problems of our time? Probably perpetual energy, being able to create mass from nothing, and anti-gravity. The problem is we don't have an attack on those problems. If I walk the Tufts, one of my favorite things in Boston is this. It almost looks like a tombstone. It was from the Anti-Gravity Research Foundation in 1933. This guy, Roger Babson, he founded Babson College, a business school in the area. His grandson, unfortunately, drowned, and he thought that donating money to an anti-gravity research foundation to develop gravitational shielding would kind of solve the problem. And unfortunately, almost 100 years later, we still don't have an attack. But to kind of bring it back to why there's 30 data observability tools is like, now we actually have an attack on this problem, where warehouses, being able to scale up compute independently of both storage, but also other, sources of query loads, right? So you don't chomp on your analytics reporting, have made it such that we can collect this sort of metadata about systems. And I think without, having this trade-off between data quality and data performance. And that's why we started with the warehouse.
That totally makes sense. I mean, it's, Joe, you're fond of saying, everything that's old is new again. Yeah. And we see it again and again in data. And, I feel like 5 years ago, even data warehousing was kind of written off, and it's resurged because it's a very, very convenient paradigm in a variety of ways, especially with this enhancement of separating compute and storage and pushing things to the cloud.
Yeah. It's also the old saying, fish where the fish are.
Yeah.
So, you wouldn't probably go to like your first inclination would be like, oh, I'm going to do this for like, DynamoDB or something, like, it's
totally.
So
it reminds me of, that something is useful in nature when multiple species have developed it independently. Like analogous evolution, like a porcupine is not related to a cactus, right? And yet they both have spines. Right. And ClickHouse has very different origins from Snowflake. Actually, the people who use Snowflake probably are not the same people who use ClickHouse, and vice versa. And yet they serve a very similar function, right? Rollout. They're implemented differently, they're marketed differently. But I think that's how we know that warehousing is perhaps actually a useful technology that's here to stay.
Mm-hmm. For sure. I should kind of bring it back. We got a couple of questions here. One from Petri. What's up? What is data observability in a 160 character tweet understandable for business people? Then actually Jake Carter. What's up, Jake? What is a good summarization of the relationship between observability and governance? So it's sort of like a 1.5 part question. But if you want to take this one first, that would be great. And obviously you have to keep it to 160 characters. So go for it.
In as few words as possible. I can't do character counts when speaking, but it's
don't teach it at MIT. Come on.
Yeah, no, you don't like compute. It's data observability is a concept that describes how much visibility you have into your data systems, and this visibility is useful to know when data quality issues have occurred, and to help you know the impact of those issues and how to debug those issues. I don't know if that's 160 words, but I think that's like, a nugget.
No, that's a good summarization of it, though. I tend to agree with that. How you summarize that. What do you think, Matt? Is it pass the Matt test?
Yeah, I like that. And of course, go again, everyone listening to this, go listen to Tobias Macy's interview with Kevin as well, where you give a much deeper explanation of data observability from the context. I mean, you go into engineering, like steam engines and physics and software development, eventually loop back. But yeah, that's awesome for 160 character short version. And if that sounds intriguing, like dive into the long version too.
Yeah, what was it, the data engineering podcast or
Yeah.
something? Yeah, whatever. Yeah, it's a good podcast. Tobias is cool.
Yeah.
He's awesome.
Matt and I make a cameo appearance in his book 97 Things a Data Engineer Should Know. I think we're 2 out of the 97 things you should know. So
Oh, nice.
yeah. But anyway, Tobias is cool. And Jake's question here: what is a good summarization of the relationship between observability and governance? What do you think about that, Kevin?
It kind of goes back to data quality is a problem. Data observability is a technology, right? It's a solution. And we were joking before the show. People don't wake up in the morning saying, "I need an observability tool." Right, like
they certainly don't. That would be if you do make comment, please.
Yeah, if you do, please comment. And also get in touch with us. We definitely want to chat. No, well, governance is actually a problem, or I would say is actually it's a suite of problems, right, related to compliance with external standards, internal standards, and fulfilling expectations between different parties. Right, whether it's between the data team and the consumers of data, or between your company and its business obligations, its customers and partners. And you could do this without technology. I think many companies do, but it's easier when you have a lot of metadata. So that, to give you a small example, is like, let's say you're trying to be GDPR compliant. It's kind of hard to do that without knowing what the sources of potentially sensitive data are and where it goes and how it's being used. Is much easier when you have that kind of a map. And that's where lineage and observability come in, right? It's a technology that makes it easier to do some of the jobs of governance. Would you guys agree with that?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, and I think it's very important to tell the organizational and human story with any of these tools, right? And
Totally.
that's the critique often. It's like, okay, you're throwing another tool at me. I've seen so many tools come and go over the last decade.
Yeah.
What problem are you actually solving? And one thing that's really cool about Metaplane, and maybe you can talk about this more, but is the fact that it's a human in the loop oriented tool. In other words, part of the metadata that you're looking at, and you said in that interview I mentioned that you have to have this metadata for the tool to work. Part of the metadata that you're looking at is how those tables are consumed by users, by downstream processes, so both like human and technological processes.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, data is created to be used, right? It's awesome to get a lot of data in your Snowflake. It's even more awesome when it's being used throughout the organization. And one of the, it's a relatively simple question of like, what are my most used tables today? Having answered that question might be pretty impactful. Lets you know what tables to invest in, what tables can be refactored. But frankly, the tools don't exist to easily answer that question. So that's like one of the problems that an observability tool might address for you.
So what's the difference between data observability and machine learning observability? I see on the kind of I don't know if it's the other side of the fence, but there's another plot of land called machine learning. So like where does data observability begin and end with machine learning observability, or all these like false dichotomies?
I think you're right that there are two different plots of land, right? I believe data observability ends with where the data is being consumed. And so in the case of if the data in your Snowflake is being used as inputs to a machine learning model, right, you might take features materialized in Snowflake and send them over to however you're training your model. And you could use a data observability tool to track like feature drift, right? This distribution of an input variable. How is the mean changing, or how's the standard deviation changing? I believe that's where machine learning observability tools start. Is they start with monitoring your features, but they go much further into the models. Like, what is the training objective, right? Like the training accuracy over time, what's the actual deployment accuracy over time, what's the mismatch between those? More like health monitoring for models.
So where does data quality fit into this then? I mean, because obviously, if you're talking about structured data models or models built on structured data, I should rephrase that. Like, where does data quality play a role? Both as an input, I would say, to the model training, and then maybe for retraining.
I think machine learning models are notoriously finicky. Sorry, finicky isn't a word.
That's a new word. So
new coinage today. Right
yeah, exactly.
it's one vowel off from like a cool word. So
yeah, exactly. If you played in bananagrams, I wouldn't complain. But the slight variations in the input can lead to drastically different predictions, right? We've seen like adversarial attacks where I show this piece of noise, and suddenly every computer vision model thinks that it's a banana.
Mm-hmm.
And so being able to track these slight differences in inputs actually does have an effect on the downstream use cases of the model.
Yeah, because something I was thinking a lot about is I was just writing in our book about just data quality, and and kind of the intersection of that with sort of BI use cases as well as ML use cases, right? And so where does one begin at the other end? It's like, well, one of these, because basically, if you're using like a data warehouse now, that could be an input into obviously reports as well as models, and then how do you segregate these two, or do you? And so maybe it went down this rabbit hole of kind of like I notoriously do, just overthinking everything. And but when I was writing about observability, I was like, okay, so this is interesting, and because on one hand, these are inputs into both, right, and reverse ETL as well, right? So now you have three destinations that you could potentially use this data for.
Yeah, it's one of my best friends works for NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association.
Shout out NOAA, great weather report. Love NOAA.
Yeah, they're doing great. And he was telling me about how they put together spaceships, like rockets.
Wow.
And it turns out that to screw in one component, to even put in one screw, a worker comes up, writes down exactly what they're going to do, takes the single screw out of a bag, uses a fresh screwdriver, goes in, screws it, all videotaped, I believe, comes out, puts it back into the bag, and then takes a recording of that. Right. So it makes sense, right? This multi-billion-dollar asset, right? Any number of these things could go wrong. And I was thinking, the quality of these rockets is important, of course. That's ultimately what matters, is how many nines do you have on the reliability of this system. But observability is more akin to when did you put in this screw at some point? Because what they have now is they have a model of when this rocket came together, every single step of the process, and they can trace it back to know what exactly the root cause was of a potential issue, which hopefully doesn't happen.
Joe, are you thinking about supply chain now?
Yeah.
Joe's an old supply chain guy.
I was thinking about that.
I'm not calling you old, by the way.
Well, I am. So say it like it is. No, I was just more thinking that's one, like, really impressive. I had no idea that level of like meticulous care was put into at that level of detail. Like, that's insanely awesome, actually.
Yeah, awesome.
My brain was just more bending at like how quickly can they build a rocket at doing those kind of steps. But I think that's impressive. So
it definitely is a bottleneck, I think. I do wonder how quickly you could build a rocket with no quality assurances at all. Just like slam it together. I'm not sure someone should run that experiment, but it's interesting.
Yeah, without a human
yeah, exactly.
pilot. So it kind of reminds me, I was talking about this with somebody else, but it reminds me back in the kind of in the 70s with American manufacturing of automobiles, and how the incentives were such, we just need to get cars out. I don't really care how you do it, just get them out. And so you'd have cars coming off the assembly lines. I think this was at Fremont and the Toyota factory back in the day. But was it Toyota or something like that? Anyway, like engines were coming in backwards and stuff. Stories like this, right? And But the crew had no incentive to, they're just like, I just need to get cars out. I don't care if they're done right. So, and I think this is sort of where, the modern lean practices came to America, because I think it was the apocryphal tale, and the audience, feel free to correct me on this, because, I have, as they point out, I'm old. I have a fuzzy memory now. So I'm just kidding. But I think it was basically like they opened up a factory, and just to kind of contract out manufacturing to the U.S. And then they're just like, this is a junk show, so let's come and fix it. And so that's where you started getting, these kind of more standardized practices in the U.S. For manufacturing. But it's, I always tie things back to, if you look at where DevOps was back in the day. I mean, DevOps took a lot of its inspiration from Lean, right? If you go back to the DevOps handbook, Jez Humble and all these, early DevOps practitioners and authors, it's like their inspiration came directly from manufacturing and supply chain. And what I find interesting in a lot of these examples is data ops is the same way. You read the data ops, books that, the writings of, Chris Berg, shout out to Chris, he's awesome. But there's definitely a big underpinning of just, quality control, all these things that we've been talking about for a really long time. And now it's, happening in ML ops, and sort of the same thing. But the constant theme of this talk is what's old is new again, right? And so, but observability is definitely one of those things where it's just sort of like quality control of your assembly line, if you want to look at it that way, right? So you have robotic vision now that can track, quality, automatically these days, depending what you're trying to train on. But so,
yeah, I love the DevOps analogy, because one, there was a clear transition when that kind of happened in the early 2010s. So you can see how the data world is behind, not by too much, but that too, like, it kind of speaks to the maturity of a field, how, these quality assurance practices impact speed, right? Because in data, you could argue it just, yet another thing for me to do, and it might slow down
right,
what I have to do. But in software, right, in many ways, test-driven development actually makes you faster in the long run. And like CI/CD and all of these best practices, right, in the moment might slow you down, but in the long run, speed you up really drastically, especially as the scope of the team and the project increase.
Reminds me of this morning. I've been running a lot, and I've been doing a math training, the Maffetone method, which is it's really easy. You take 180 and subtract your age, and that's your heart rate. So it's absurdly slow, actually, because I'm used to doing CrossFit, so I'm like an anaerobic athlete. So I'm trying to build up more of an aerobic base, and I find like, it's the old saying, you got to go slow to go fast. But it reminds me a lot of what you just said, where it's like, it's going to be painful to the point where you're just annoyed, because I'm there like, why am I at like 12 miles an hour for a mile? This is ridiculous. But I should be able to run like 7 or 8, but building the engine. What's that?
And, adding even more pressure to that, right? Like, for a head of data who's being hired today, right? They're feeling pressure to justify their spend, to justify themselves, unless there's a big overarching mandate. It's like, I got to get quick results sometimes, right? And in that case, you're pressured to do CrossFit instead of doing this method.
Well, you're attempting to do CrossFit without even going through the fundamentals of how to move, like, and lift. So it's CrossFit is notorious for injuring people, and that's kind of what I think to your analogy. Like, the head of data is going in day one, not knowing how to like do a deadlift, for example, and they break their back, and it's like, well, I got to keep going because I got to get this done. As Matt knows, I'm like an exercise nerd as well. So, but it is interesting, because we do see this temptation a lot with heads of data, where they get into a job, and you're absolutely right. There's the game's on. You got to deliver. Again, I don't really care how you do it. So it's kind of like this, the car analogy too, where it's like, just, if the engine's in backwards, I guess whatever, man. As long as I'm getting the reports out, because it's an interesting question, right? Because business value, it ultimately goes back to business value. Matt and I always nerd out on this question though. Like, so what exactly do you mean by value? Everyone talks about delivering value to the business. If you unpack that statement for a second, though, it's like, well, so what are you talking about when you say value? So I don't know if you have
like, are you
thoughts on that?
Like, businesses exist to make money or cut costs, right? And internally, you either make money or cut costs or reduce risk.
Mhm.
So, like you're saying, like what exactly are you doing for the company? And I think this depends so much on the vertical, and kind
Yeah.
of why we see data adoption is not, you know, in some companies it's a way ahead, right? E-commerce, I would argue, is like, data is your lifeblood in
It
many
has to
ways.
be. Yeah.
It has to be, and there's so many ways that you can use it to impact those three things, right? You know, revenue, cost, risk. For other companies, yeah, maybe you do have to take a little bit of a leap of faith and be a bit more creative about how data is sold and used for the long-term impact of the company. But yeah, we know for sure that it's much easier when there's a quarterly company goal that's tied to how you use it.
So let me take this perspective for a second and almost be the devil's advocate and say that traditional approach to business, especially in the US, is like very capital focused. So make more money, cut costs. And now there's kind of the school of thought that's more product focused that says, okay, Google becomes successful, they turn into, a $1 trillion company by having a great product in front of everything else. And I think increasingly the shift we're seeing in data is that analytics data, not just like production data, but analytics data is starting to work its way into products. And so I'll put you on the spot here. Can you think of an example from one of your customers? You can maybe anonymize it or something, where observability has helped them to improve their product somehow, where their product got better because they had observability.
Yeah, the first things that come to mind are like analytics reporting dashboards for your end users. So we are used by a lot of B2B SaaS companies, and many of them bring on Snowflake, not just for internal reporting, but also to have, their customers know how the data is being used and trending over time. So once they show something to their customers, it's getting a little bit, there's multiple parties involved now, but the data cannot be wrong. So having an observability tool like ours or any of the other offerings out there does make them much more confident in being able to ship that feature. One other example is with, honestly, a lot, like we're used by a lot of, investment banks. So companies in finance. And of course, data is directly tied to a dollar in that case. But for them to make decisions on this data, like confidence is key. So I think bringing on Metaplane does speed things up in that case.
That's cool. Does that answer your question, Matt?
I think so. Yeah.
Awesome.
It seems to be a trend. I mean, I don't know if you agree, Joe, but like I think we're seeing more and more requests for help with exactly the use case you're talking about, Kevin. In the first example, like user-facing dashboards, user-facing analytics.
Yeah, data applications. I think some people, there's a
Yeah.
parlance nowadays, data apps, and so we're seeing a lot more of these. Like I think the number of requests we've been getting for, say, embedded analytics use cases is just skyrocketed. That tends to be overwhelmingly the types of stuff that people want these days, and just giving users direct access to data, help them make better decisions, and if you can do it in real time, preferably, that's even better. So so people are adopting low latency databases like your ClickHouses,
Right.
Firebolts. I know Snowflake's getting, they're working on some improvements with latency as well. And, Imply and Druid is another big one that we see a lot. So yeah, but this is becoming kind of table. I almost look at it like kind of OLAP 3 or 4.0 right now, where you're moving away from kind of the rigid data modeling. I think that still needs to happen, but a lot of that's for internal business use cases. But at the same time, we're starting to see just kind of direct, just set up Kafka to your kind of low latency OLAP database and put a embedded dashboard behind it and let it rip. So I don't know if the data is right or not, but that doesn't matter.
It's directionally correct.
It's directionally correct.
Yeah. And this is where Matt's idea of having a database that can almost swap out different storage patterns and query patterns is like makes a lot of sense. A ClickHouse supports different types of engines. You can use a merge tree, or you can use a log family of engines that depends on the, how you want to use this data and the size of the data. So I think it's such why doesn't Snowflake add a Postgres driver that if you have many, many inserts, you kind of swap it over. Or if storage is so cheap, you just store it both ways.
Yep.
Yeah, these databases are already doing automatic reclustering, so they're meant to auto-optimize to some extent, just not quite that far. And maybe there's an observability play too, because you talk about like not only observing the number of rows and the number of users hitting a table, but like query performance. How well is my database performing?
Yep.
Am I inserting too much into it? These kinds of questions that Snowflake has talked a lot about getting rid of DBAs. I don't think that's realistic. I think there's still a lot of work for DBAs to do.
Well, they just go work at Snowflake.
They go. There we go.
Right. I mean, you'll see someone to like tune the database.
Right.
So,
but they use
actually that's a clever hiring ploy for sure. It's like, you're not going to need these guys anymore. So
yeah.
But if you're interested in having a job, give us a call. We can talk. So actually got a question here, kind of throwing it back to the lean stuff real quick, but Jay's a cool dude, so I'll answer it. Based on your experience, what is the impact of having lean manufacturing implemented across an organization and the overall data quality, observability, and governance? Maybe I think you're talking about maybe lean manufacturing practices, perhaps. But I'll take this one. And you can if you riff on this, but I think a lot of it's more cultural. I would say like lean isn't really a technical thing. It's Toyota, when they made it, it was intentionally very low fidelity, right? Like the end-on cord, for example. So there's a cord you pull, and then the production line stops if there's an error, right? If there's a defect that's detected, it's cheaper to stop the entire line and just fix that issue than it is to let it just kind of go, and build up. The Kanban board is the same way. It was literally just like a board with you just move visuals, right? In some cases, just placards from one place to the other. So I think it's more just getting people on board. I think culturally and practices like that, you can try and do it, force people to do it, or try and do a technical solution. But I think most of the time we see technical solutions without the cultural sort of adoption just doesn't really go anywhere. So what do you guys think?
I totally agree on how it's cultural first, and why technology should almost always be viewed from the perspective of, does it actually change the organization? I think one benefit of the lean methodology is really the focus on process, and the entire end-to-end system, especially the interplay between roles. And I bring that up because all of this kind of quality, observability, governance, it bundles up into trust, right? And what to really kind of simplify it, trust is how confident you are that another party will fulfill their contract or their expectations. And kind of in lieu of a formal contract, we have informal expectations. And unfortunately for data teams, there's a lot of informal expectations about what you do and what you're responsible for, right? Data teams might think that if they're the first to find out about a data issue and they let you know, the presumption in many cases is this not your job, right? Didn't we hire the data team so that you tell me when there's an issue? Why am I telling you that there's an issue? But there's a disconnect. So I think, having a very concrete process in place to talk about these contracts is a huge, boon overall. Because in some ways, you can have poor data quality and no observability or governance, but still have an environment of high trust in data because you've set the expectations correctly.
Thoughts, Matt?
How do we, let's go back to what you said about people being unhappy when they point out data quality issues. I think this kind of siloing is actually a huge problem. The problem I think we have in general in tech is that we have gotten into a very siloed mentality where you have software developers and DevOps maybe over here, then you have your data engineers or DBAs, and then you have your consumers. And really, if they can work as one team culturally, they're much more successful. Like, how is the data engineer supposed to know the data better than the domain expert, either the software developer or the business user, or really both? So how do we change those expectations, and not in a way where you're setting low data quality expectations, but rather saying, hey, we're going to work together to make data better?
I think it is, I love this, why is it that doctors have notoriously bad handwriting? One theory is that it's because they never have to read their own handwriting. The pharmacist does. But that the moment, what they wrote down had to go into their EHR system, and the EHR system is used to kind of evaluate, the doctor themselves. Oh, now it's suddenly getting better. Right. When there's no cost to your actions, you'll just do whatever benefits yourself. Right. But the moment that, the data that you produce, whether it's, how clean an input field into Salesforce is, or how rapidly you change your, amplitude event schema, the moment that you suffer because of that, now it's like a virtuous cycle. And also why I think reverse ETL will have a very positive impact on data quality.
That's really interesting.
This totally cuts back to the Toyota example, Joe.
Totally.
Mm-hmm. All things lead back to Toyota. So awesome. I think we're coming up on time, actually. It's been a fun chat. I always feel like I come away a lot smarter talking to you. So I think Matt feels the same way. And
oh yeah, definitely.
It goes both ways for sure. I gotta immerse myself in Lean, get some Six Sigma in my life.
A really good book is The Toyota Way.
Yeah.
I would say go check that out. That's a great book. Six Sigma is an interesting one. I kind of have mixed feelings about it. On one hand, I think it's good, but you also start driving towards the measures, I think, at the expense of, maybe things that matter more. And so, I was a Six Sigma nerd for a long time. But I don't know, I kind of somewhat disillusioned on it. So.
I feel like Jack Welch kind of gave Six Sigma
he ruined it.
Yeah, because it became just this like mantra as opposed to an actual statistical practice. At General Electric, at least my dad worked there back in the day, and yeah, it seemed it was used in ways that actually disrupted the business in many cases, and the training didn't actually focus on statistics or how to statistically improve quality very much at that point. So.
Yeah, my mom also worked at GE.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, what division? Like
electronics.
Okay, my dad was in healthcare, like worked on medical X-ray equipment, basically.
Can't believe it's one company doing all of this. But speaking of, organizational processes.
It's interesting. I'll have another chat about all this kind of stuff. So once you like Lean and quality control and stuff. I mean, it's all related for sure. I mean, I'm curious if there's ever going to be like a Six Sigma for data, with data quality and stuff. That'll be very fascinating to see. So. With everyone borrowing stuff from supply chain and manufacturing, I suppose it's only a matter of time. So, I mean, geez, I have a bookshelf over in the next room where it's just full of like Six Sigma books and Lean books and all that kind of stuff. A really good book, actually, you should check out too, is Learning to See or Learning How to See. It's a book on value stream mapping. That is amazing. It's such a good book.
I'm not getting nerd sniped again by you guys.
This one is a bit less. This isn't as cool as Newton, but in counterfeiting money, I thought that was awesome. But yeah, well, cool. I guess to kind of wrap it up. Thanks for coming on. It's always a pleasure to chat with you. So hopefully we can maybe meet in Boston again when the weather's better and go for a nice stroll around the city. So that was a fun time.
The weather and the Omicron. We're waiting for the weather and the Omicron, basically.
Yeah. The Omicron, I put a kibosh on a lot of things in Utah recently. We now back under mask mandate and waiting to see the cases today. It should be insane. So
Sundance in person got canceled again, which is a sad state of affairs.
Yeah, sucks. Cool. On that tree. So for people who want to learn more about you and Metaplane, how would they do that?
Google Metaplane or Google Kevin Zienge, who you can check out Metaplane, metaplane.dev. Try it out. We'd love to hear your feedback. And, it's awesome talking to you both. I've been a long time listener. Shout out to my friend Mike Rogo, data engineer at HubSpot, who first got me onto your show a long time ago. So I appreciate what you guys do.
That's awesome. Yeah, it seems to be kind of this underground thing now where like people know about us, but we've definitely got some good commentary. Like it's like this is one of the most underrated shows in data, and so I don't know. I suppose it is. But cool. Next week we got Matt Siorma, actually out of Canada. He's a MDM person, data governance. This will be. It's interesting how many data governance people we talk to these days, and observability. But I think it's a theme right now, right? And kind of bringing it back to sort of the title of the talk, data observability trends. I think more of the trend of 2022 is data observability and data governance. I think that's the trend. So it started getting off to a good start last year, and I think 2019. But I think it's going to be hitting full force now, and for foreseeable future. So it's awesome. A good place to be.
Yeah, I'm excited. The data space is so early. It's kind of like we live in a bubble, right, where everyone already has Snowflake and Looker and DBT, but the majority of the world are not using that stack, are not using observability, reverse ETL, or even a BI tool in many ways. So I think things are really going to start changing from here.
Oh yeah, for sure. I think we still see the most is like SQL Server on-prem is the most data warehouses that we see. And on that note, if you're interested in modernizing your data warehouse, please contact Ternary.com. Ternary Data, that's our company. So, and smash the like button on YouTube. Check it out, Ternary Data. Subscribe to our newsletter at ternarydata.com. And if you're interested in a data engineering team as a service, hit us up. We can help modernize your SQL Server data warehouse, get Metaplane in there for your observability and so forth. So yeah, man, it's good to see you though. So we'll chat again soon. All right, have a good one.
Great to see you.
Thanks
both.
to the audience.
Stay safe.
Yeah, thanks to the audience too for the great questions and comments, and thanks Matt as always. So see you guys next week. Bye.